lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing a mid-month wrap-up for the month of June for everything that I've read so far. So far, in the month of June, I have read 15 books, of which 2 of them are novellas, and I also DNF'd a book. This is technically doubling as my wrap-up for the Readathon Feel Goodathon, which I can link my TBR down below if you fancy, but if I'm entirely honest, I feel like the beginning of the month was very intense across the world with a lot of the social unrest that was happening, so the prompts of the Feel Goodathon, I don't think anyone was feeling particularly good, so I kind of just started ignoring them and reading whatever really appealed on my bookshelf. So I'm not going to talk about how these books relate in connection with the prompts. If I tried really hard I could probably make everything fit the prompts, but I really just can't be bothered right now. So slightly differently today, we're going to be talking about the books in groupings of genre, because I do have some very distinctive groups going on, so I thought that'd be a fun way to do this wrap up. And the first one we're going to talk about is we're going to be talking about contemporary romances. I read 4 contemporary romances I believe so far this month. The first one I read was the Bromance Book Club by Lyssa K. Adams. This was really enjoyable. So the Bromance Book Club is quite popular on BookTube, but basically it is about a guy who finds out that his wife has been faking orgasms their entire marriage, and she also wants a divorce on top of that, not related to the orgasms, related to other things, but it really becomes the catalyst that causes this big blowout fight in their marriage. And his mates and kind of work colleagues bring him into this book club that they have where they read romance books to try and get more in touch with their feelings and work on their relationships so that he can try and save his marriage. It sounds a little twee and a little frankly absurd from the outside, but it actually used the romance book club as a really interesting way of framing the dialogue of what do people want in a relationship, but also what do romance books tell us about what people want in a relationship and what are the lessons from it. And it really became a discussion of toxic masculinity and the desire to try and get in touch with your emotions and your feelings and the importance of communication in a relationship. One thing I really enjoyed about this romance was that it was a pre-established couple, and it was about 2 people rediscovering their love for each other and working through problems, rather than it being the kind of standard format of that first love, new relationship. So I really enjoyed that just as a bit of a kind of change of pace, and it was really nice to see that actually the marriage isn't the happily ever after that a lot of romance books seem to think that it is, or definitely imply that it is, and actually a relationship is about continuous and ongoing work. Also, both of the characters in this, the lead male and the lead female, had things that they worked through. So it wasn't just that he was coming to terms with some issues he had around kind of emotion and toxic masculinity. She had a whole host of things as well that they really discussed and worked through, and there wasn't any particular blame on either side placed, so I really appreciated all of that in general. I know that there is a sequel coming out soon, or might even be out already, and I'm totally keen for it, and I really think that this one was excellent. Another romance that I really enjoyed was Beach Read by Emily Henry. This one, again, I'm really enjoying these kind of slightly meta romance books that acknowledge the trope of romance and discuss the genre that is romance within the book itself. In this one, our 2 main characters are 2 writers who knew each other from college. Our main character, I can't remember their name, sorry, our leading lady has had a bit of a traumatic moment in her life, and she moves into this lake house to try and kind of recover from it, but she also has a deadline looming and a massive case of writer's block. Turns out her neighbour is a writer that she knew from her college days, and they have a real like intense butting heads relationship based on the stuff from college, and they kind of goad each other into taking on a bit of a dare where they're going to swap genres and see if they can get either of their books like optioned and actually published, and basically the first person to get this published wins. So she takes on his gritty literary fiction depressing male angst books, and he takes on the light fluffy romance tropes, and then they take it in turns to kind of teach each other about the research that they need to do. So obviously a lot of the romantic tropes ensue from there, and the relationship progresses from there. I really enjoyed the fact that whilst there was a lot of ribbing at the beginning about the 2 different genres, the 2 characters really do have a lot of respect for each other's writing, and it was a really interesting way of discussing various sort of tropes and stereotypes within the publishing industry and what are we really looking for when we look at genres of books. So I thought that it was excellently done, and again both characters went on a very natural arc and growth without it being slamming on really heavy-handed misery. So I really liked this one. I thought it was absolutely excellent. The next romance book I read sadly was not quite as big a hit for me, and that was If I Never Met You by Mhairi McFarlane. This is a fake dating trope, and the idea is that our leading lady wants to get back at her ex, who has cheated on her, left her, and then shacked up with some woman who was also in the office and got her pregnant very quickly. And our leading man needs to change his reputation for being a bit of a womanizer if he wants to get a promotion at work, so he needs to fake a long-standing relationship, and it's about the two of them doing this to try and support each other. It does have a few of the really classic fake dating tropes that are in there, and I thought I enjoyed the fake dating concept because it's one that I really like in fan fiction, but I'm kind of having a bad time with finding any fake dating romances that I enjoy. I've only read 2 or 3 so far, so I'm not willing to give up on it, but this one really just didn't land, and I think the big problem with it was basically that it just was too sad in places. Like, I want to come to romance to have a good time, and one thing that really sucked about this one was both of the main characters go through a lot of trauma, both within the actual kind of events of the book, but also referencing back to things from their past, and I just felt like it was laying that on too thick. The beginning of the book really takes a while to get into it, and the author really set up the leading lady's like main relationship and like this long-standing relationship before he cheats and leaves and pregnant woman. So I think it was really something like 30% of the way through the book before we even got to like the fake dating aspect of it, and I just felt that it was too slow paced and took up way too much of the time, and we spent a long time wallowing in like rage at relationship. And maybe it's just what I'm personally looking for when I pick up a contemporary romance, is basically light-hearted fluff that functions in a similar way that popcorn functions in your diet, and maybe that's on me for not seeing the nuances of the genre, not wanting the nuances of the genre potentially, but this one almost, if it weren't for the fake dating trope and how tropey that is, this almost makes more sense to be something that's more of a kind of standard contemporary fiction rather than like contemporary romance. I almost think it's been billed slightly wrong. It's not to say that I didn't enjoy it, it's just that it was like really heavy going in places, so that was one that I personally struggled with. The last contemporary romance that I read was The New Guy by Kathryn Freeman. This is where our leading lady has had a bit of an emotional day, and she does something entirely out of character and ends up having a hot and heavy one-night stand with a guy from the bar who she is definitely not her type, and she has no intention of pursuing any further. Then the next morning she goes into work to find out that actually the new guy who is starting at her work, who she is technically the boss of, is actually the guy from the bar, and it progresses from there. I enjoyed this one. I thought it was good fun. It definitely wasn't like the big hit like Bromance Book Club or Beach Reads, but it was generally entertaining. Both of the characters are like chalk and cheese and very have some very unlikable traits in both of them, but you kind of do grow to enjoy them, and it's sort of I warmed to the story as it went along. There were a few bits at the beginning where I went a little bit kind of like eye-rolly, but actually I was really invested by the end, and what I really appreciated about it was it didn't go for the big dramatic happily ever after, here's the proposal scene that so many romance books seem to be determined to crowbar in, regardless of whether it kind of adds anything to the story or not at the end. The discussion of the fact that she was the boss and he was her employee was one that I felt like could have had a bit more nuance to it, but I generally enjoyed the various sort of, like, romance books always have something that the character is working through, so that there can be a little bit of sort of a sadness, a kind of angst element to it, and I generally appreciated what both the characters were going through because it was the right level of kind of angst for me personally, so I definitely enjoyed this one. Moving on from contemporary romance, I have been continuing with my paranormal romance series. I read Defy the Dawn by Lara, Adrian, and then Midnight Unbound and Midnight Untamed, which are the novellas. I won't be talking in crazy amounts of detail about them here because I do plan to do an entire video dedicated to it, but it's basically paranormal romance with vampires. You can see the previous wrap-ups if you care about the series. I'm on book like 14 now, so let's not talk about it here. Let's move on to talk about non-fiction very briefly. It's not been particularly heavy non-fiction reading month so far, but I'm hoping that will change. I have control over it. That will change as the month goes on. So I actually DNF'd a non-fiction book this month, and that was The Professor and the Madman, Tale of Murder, Insanity and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary by Simon Winchester. I'm kind of bummed out that I decided to DNF this, but it really just wasn't working for me. This is about the story of how the Oxford English Dictionary was created, and one of the major contributors to it actually being at the time locked up in a mental asylum for murder, and the kind of intrigue and what happened there. It's something that I thought I would be more into, but honestly this felt quite slow paced, and there was a lot of additional like lots of information around that I didn't feel particularly relevant, which is quite impressive given how short the book is. And I just didn't really feel like that there was particularly actually a story worth telling here. I read probably around 120 pages of it, so you know, we're talking a good third of it at least, and honestly I wasn't bothered. And I think it was really telling that I brought this with me on a few, like, we were going food shopping and I was waiting in the car kind of things, and every time I had it as the book that I was supposed to be reading, I would pretty much do everything in my power to not pick it up. Like, I was playing around on my phone, I'd ring people, I'd watch you, like, I'd do anything to not read it, and I think that really is indicative of whether you actually care or not. So I've decided to let this one pass me by. I think if you're interested in true crime potentially more than me, you'll enjoy it, but personally I just didn't actually care. Then we have a reread that I did at the beginning of the month, and that is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo Lodge. So I picked this one up because of the protests that were going on across the world linked to police brutality from the Black Lives Matter movement, and technically I read this, so I read this back in 2018, I believe, for Non-Fiction November. What I really enjoy about this book is it's actually focused on Britain and British racism, because a lot of the books out there really focus on America, and Reni Eddo Lodge decides to discuss this in this. The title comes from, she had a blog post that came out that was basically why she no longer wanted to engage with white people about discussions of racism because of essentially how much we don't listen. And then from there, the kind of movement that sparked, and how when she announced that she didn't want to talk about it anymore, suddenly everybody wanted to listen. This book is really broken into almost kind of a collection of essays which are looking at different topics, and the ones that really resonated were, for me personally, were the section on British history, which is something that I really didn't know a crazy amount about, and we definitely don't talk about in our curriculum, but also the one looking at the intersectionality of feminism and how badly we do on that one, and also kind of conversations between class and racism, and how often the British debate gets framed that we have a class issue, not a race issue, and how that colourblind attitude to it is deeply problematic. This is really a key example of, for me personally in my reading, why reading one book is not enough, and why coming back to these books is really important, and how easy it is to read, digest, and then not make long-term changes. And I'm not saying that I'm necessarily automatically going to do better this time around because I've read the book a second time, but it was amazing how much reading it a second time I got out of it, and how easy it is to see that if you don't do continual work in these areas, then actually these things can fall by the wayside very quickly. So it was deeply informative for a second time around read. Let's talk about sci-fi now. So I read 2 sci-fi books this month, which was really good fun actually. I've been kind of a bit more on a sci-fi kick. I'm really enjoying it. I'm delighting in world building. The first one that I finished was Summerland by Hannu Rajaniemi. This is a funky, weird style of sci-fi. I don't really know whether it technically counts as sci-fi or not. I get very confused by what counts as like sci-fi and what is speculative, etc, etc, but we're going to count it in the sci-fi bracket. So this basically is a slight historical take on this kind of sci-fi idea, and it is set in the 1930s, and basically in the First World War human beings discovered the way to kind of harness the dead and harness souls and be able to use them as a form of kind of energy, but also as a way to keep the population going, because if you were given a specific ticket with a specific pattern that you can memorize, you could come back and actually retain your memories and be able to still be kind of useful and keep sort of providing to society as such. And the book is focused on some kind of riffing off of some ideas of Second World War, but basically concerns about the Soviets and Russia and Stalin, and also some stuff going on in Spain at the time, but with this overlay of the dead being like a functioning part of our society. Like with any sort of sci-fi like this, I really enjoyed the fact that Hannu Rajaniemi wasn't too worried about like how much of the world building you got at the beginning, and he kind of really eked it out as we went, and it was about sort of piecing these things together. And I've kind of walked away from it not even fully sure that I understand the rules of the world, but I really enjoyed finding out about them and kind of being teased about them. At its heart, it's kind of a political intrigue thriller, but there were so many other things going on that I really appreciated, and it was just so much fun learning about the different kind of world. Turns out I've actually read another one of his books before, years ago. I read The Quantum Thief back when I was a teenager and had like no idea what was going going on at the time with it, but I think I was reading a lot of sci-fi books at the time, and the world building across the different books I was reading kept getting jumbled, so I might be tempted to come back to it. The other sci-fi that I read is Rosewater by Tade Thompson. This was fantastic. I actually finished it last night. This is the latest book that I finished. So Tade Thompson is a Nigerian author, I believe, and this is set in Nigeria, and basically it's set into, well, it's primarily set in 2066, but there are definitely elements of earlier sort of time periods going on, and aliens have landed on Earth, and there is some kind of freaky biodome that humans aren't too sure exactly what it's doing there or why it's there, what's going on. But once the aliens have kind of arrived, the people, some people start to develop sort of psychic abilities, and it's how they've been built into the world. I don't want to say a crazy amount more than that, because again, similar to Summerland, this one really sort of dishes out parts of the world building, parts of the plot in quite a slow, measured way, and it doesn't do like a huge exposition dump at the beginning. And what I really enjoyed about this book was actually we had a lot of different not timelines going on, but we kind of jumped around in time quite a lot. So our main character, we got to see lots of stuff happening from earlier, as well as the kind of current day timeline that was occurring for him, and that was really fun because again it eked out all sorts of different really pivotal events that happened in the history of this alien biodome and in his history, and it was really fascinating seeing these kind of pieces of the puzzle be very slowly given out and in a very jumbled order, so you had to kind of piece it together yourself. This is actually the first book in a trilogy, but I think I was reading a few reviews this morning and I agree with some of them where this could almost be treated as a bit of a standalone about our main character, and then it kind of teases at there being a bigger threat at the end, so you could potentially leave it here, but obviously why wouldn't you want to continue because of how cool it is. I loved the way that the alien psychics happened, and it was kind of connected with sort of plants and fungi and the idea of sort of almost hive mind elements. I might do a video on sci-fi connected with plants at some point. Let me know if you'd like to see that. I might need to read one or two more books for it, but I've got a few now, and it's a cool sub-theme in sci-fi and genres like that. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about the two middle grade books I read. So I read two books by Dianna Wynne Jones. They're in the same series. I read Howls Moving Castle, which is the first book, and then I read Castle in the Air. Dianna Wynne Jones was writing these a long time ago now. These are from my childhood, and she really is kind of a fantastic, iconic fantasy writer for children. Howls Moving Castle is the slightly more well-known one, I think. There is a Studio Ghibli movie about it, and it's about our main protagonist, Sophie, who gets a curse put on her so she looks like an old lady, and she ends up going and living with Howl, the mysterious wizard who lives in a castle that moves up on the hill, and then kind of craziness ensues. It was really fun coming back to this as a reread because actually I read this, like I said, as kind of a tween, very sort of middle grade age group, and I thought I remembered it really well, and then there were just huge chunks of it that I'd totally forgotten, and for me the kind of overall the plot, the stuff that I remembered was over in the first like 15%, so it was really fun discovering the other bits. The story then moves on to Castle in the Air. This was a new read for me, and this one is now focused, it's basically kind of riffing off of Aladdin and the Flying Carpet. Sophie and Hal don't appear until the end. There is a different character at the beginning, and for me, because of that, I wasn't anywhere near as invested in this. It really only kind of got interesting once we met up with Sophie and Hal, but I think nostalgia is kicking in there for me, so it's still a really good example of a fantasy middle grade. Basically our main protagonist has to go and rescue a princess from an evil genie. Classic. There is a book 3 which I do have on Kindle. I'm not really in the mood for middle grade right now, but at some point I probably will finish it off, and I believe that Sophie and Hal play a bigger leading role in book 3, so I'm more intrigued by that one. They do feature at the end of this one, but they weren't there for the bulk of it, and that's kind of who I'm here for. Right, classics. We're going to talk about classics and then currently read, and then we'll be done. I'm sorry it's such a long one today, guys. So the first classic that I finished is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. This was a buddy read by Paula from Draw Your Book. I will link her down below. This is the second Daphne du Maurier I've ever read, and I really enjoyed this. Daphne du Maurier was writing around the turn of the century, and This is kind of, she does very kind of gothic thriller-esque type books. Rebecca is one of her big ones. This one is about a gentleman who, his cousin, who is actually more like a father figure to him, goes traveling and ends up meeting this woman Rachel. They get married, but then the cousin mysteriously dies within only like 18 months of them being married, and our main protagonist believes that something fishy was going on there. Then Rachel comes to his manor house to see where her late husband lived, and it's about their interactions, and then the kind of obsession that our main character starts to develop, and basically, can we trust Rachel or not? It's really dark and gloomy and atmospheric and spooky, and you're never really too sure whose side she's on, and it was just absolutely glorious. Daphne du Maurier's turn of phrase is stunning, and I loved this one so much. It was so intense and so good to read, and just absolutely fantastic. I have a couple more Daphne du Mauriers on my shelf, and I'm really inclined to get to them quite soon. And if you're wondering where this gorgeous book comes from, this is one of the Virago Modern Classics editions. I would really recommend them. They're stunning, stunning, stunning. Then the book that I'm reading with, or I was reading with my parents, was Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This didn't particularly resonate for me. I can see why Henry James is kind of in the classics canon and what he did for the genre as such, for kind of the gothic novel, and I can see some of the inspirations that where it led on to. But personally for me, his writing style was just impossible to get into. This is kind of a ghost story at heart, but the sentences were so long and so many commas and so many things stacked into each other, and everything was so waffly that honestly I had no real idea what was going on at any given point. Like, Mum had to do a bit of a quick précis at the end of everything because I didn't really get what was happening, and I think I just found that his writing very dense and impenetrable. And this is coming from somebody who now reads a fair number of classics, and I feel like I've got used to some of that writing style, and it was just absolutely impossible. So Henry James is not one that I'm particularly interested in reading again, but it was nice to see the influences which will later lead on to other things. I also finished, much better one, Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. This is a French classic, translated clearly, because I can't speak French, don't know why I need to tell you that, and this is a real kind of sort of scandal novel. It kind of reminded me of My Cousin Rebecca in places, and it is about a deeply unhappy woman who is married to her sickly cousin, not really out of choice, and then she ends up starting a torrid love affair with his friend, and they decide to conspire to kill the cousin. But it's really kind of a book about being careful what you wish for, and sort of the way that karma and revenge can come back and bite you in the arse. The characters in it are utterly despicable people, and I don't normally like books with unlikable characters. I think I actually prefer books where if you're gonna have an unlikable character, I have to not like anybody, and then I can kind of appreciate it from almost like a Schadenfreude perspective. If there's just one character I don't like, then I get annoyed at that character, whereas every single person in this book was just disgusting, and I loved it. I also listened to it on audiobook, and the narrator was Kate Winslet, and she did an amazing job narrating it, so it was really, really enjoyable, and I would definitely be inclined to pick up another Emile Zola in the future. That's all the books I read, I believe. So now let's talk about what I'm currently reading. Holy crap, such a long video. So I have I have 5 books on the go at the moment. So one of them I'm reading currently is Strong Poison by Dorothy L. Sayers. This is a crime book from the golden age of crime, written around the 50s, I believe. It's one of her Lord Peter Wimsey series, think kind of like Agatha Christie. Currently not particularly vibing with it, not enjoying the writing style, very dialogue heavy, but I'm going to either attempt to finish it or DNF it today. That's it. That's the options. It's either done today or DNF'd. I've also got on the go Under the Knife, Remarkable Stories from the History of Surgery by Arnold van der Laar. This one, again, I've been kind of currently reading for ages, and I've not been wanting to pick it up because I thought that it was going to be more of a like chronological look at the history of surgery, and it really actually is exactly what it says on the tin. It's individual stories scattered, like plucked from the range of history of surgery, not in chronological order, just discussing essentially things Arnold finds cool. And like, don't get me wrong, it's still interesting, but I was kind of hoping for something that was a little bit more chronologically informative from a historical perspective. So it's slightly put me off of it, but I think I just need to jump back in because I was enjoying the bits that I was reading, even if they don't particularly flow. 2 really chunky books I've got at the moment is, one of them is 6-4 by Hideo Yokoyama. This one I'm really vibing with. It's fantastic, and I think it'll be the one that I really kind of try and sit down and blitz quite soon. So this is a Japanese translated thriller, and it is about, there's kind of three main plot lines going on. There's our main character's daughter has gone missing, and they're not too sure whether she's just run away or she's like actively gone missing from something more nefarious. He is also part of the media relations for the police, and he's having to deal with a strike and kind of protest that's happening from the press because of the police censoring various bits of information about a case. And there's a whole discussion about the relationship between the police and the press. And then there's a third discussion about a cold case that there might have been something a bit more, a young girl went missing, and it was like a ransom that went horribly wrong, and it's about whether the police bungled it and was there some kind of information and a bit of a cover up there. And so far none of them have linked up yet, and it's really slow paced and really like just kind of gently teasing out the information, but I'm loving it. I've also got two classics on the go. One of the ones that's really long is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I'm listening to this on audiobook, and it is 38 hours long, and I've listened to an hour and a half, so I'm barely scratched the surface. I think if I can get this done by the end of July, I'll be happy. David Copperfield is one of his probably longest and most expansive works. It's literally a look at like the entire life of this character, David Copperfield, and the various things that happened to him. I don't know a crazy amount more than that, but I'm enjoying it. The narrator is Richard Armitage, who I love. I think he's amazing at narrating classics, and it's really nice to kind of have on in the background whilst I'm like washing up or like pottering about doing other things. So generally I'm enjoying his work. And then the final one is I am reading The 39 Steps by John Buchan to my parents as part of our daily Zoom reading sessions. This is a very like classic spy espionage book, really enjoyable. I've seen the play that it's based on, but I don't actually know the overarching story particularly, because the play is played more like a comedy and this is like very serious and deadbeat. Generally really enjoying it, but it's quite short. We should have it done fairly soon. Jeez. Okay, so that is it from me. All the books I've read so far in June. I thought I was having a crappy reading month, but it turns out I've actually read an unbelievable amount, so well done Emma for that. In terms of TBRs going ahead, I'm not releasing one for the second half of the month. You can basically just assume that some of the stuff that I have for my Feel Good-a-thon TBR is kind of rolling over. I've chucked in a few extra ones, and then I'm picking a few books off of the two TBRs that I released for the later half of the year, one for Black authors and one for queer representation, to try and address some of the imbalances in my reading. So I'm really enjoying the sheer volume of new books that I'm finding out about, which is really cool and really good fun. So I'm trying not to limit my reading too much. I have some ideas about what I'm going to read, but basically we'll just find out at the end of the month. That's it from me. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!